Hello, River of Life Community Fellowship. It is time once again for another midweek check-in. So we've been talking in our Sunday morning services about how different events in the Old Testament foreshadow the work that Christ was going to be doing. And this week we talked about Jesus being our advocate and how he stands between us and the judgment that we deserve, and he advocates for us. And we looked at some Old Testament stories of both Abraham and Moses where they did that, where they stood between people who are about to be judged and their judgment. And it's just wonderful to think of that, my sins have earned judgment, but because of the mercy of God and because of the work of Christ, I have an advocate that speaks on my behalf and really protects me from that judgment. And that's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. But it does also, it leads to an issue that I think a lot of people have with the Christian faith, and it leads to kind of something that is kind of hard to stomach sometimes and kind of hard to deal with, and that's the fact that God has judgment, that God judges sin. And, it's hard to wrap our mind around something because, we've learned that God is just or that God is love, that, he's loving. He is the epitome of love. And so, but then we have to try to wrap our minds around how could God judge people, and how could God have wrath on people's sins if he is loving, and how do those things fit together? And it can be really hard to wrap our mind around. So I'm going to take some time today to attempt to bring some clarity to that situation of how can a loving God judge sin. And I think, one of the first things that, I always kind of hit on when dealing with this topic is that, God is love. The Bible is very clear about that. God is love. It's a part of who he is. It's a part of how he works. It's a part of all things of him. But at the same time, God is also just. And, and being just, God has to punish wrongdoing. You think about a judge. If someone came before the judge and they were a murderer, they murdered someone, and the judge says, "Oh, it's first offense, no big deal. We'll just let it go." That judge would not be just. Justice would not be served. And so, in order for God to be just, he must deal with wrongdoing. And that can be a part. Okay, well, why does God judge this? Why is this wrongdoing? Why does he get to say? And that's the part that I think a lot of people really stick on, is how come God says some things are sin, and how come he judges those things? It doesn't seem like he should. But when we step back and think about it, the truth is God is the creator. And the creator, he created all things, and he also created the rules. And so he gets to decide. He gets to decide this is right, this is wrong. And that's the way it is. And when we have the ability to do what God does, then, as Francis Chan puts it this way, when you can create a chicken, then you can talk to God about his creation. We can't create anything. We are the created, not the creator. So we don't get to decide whether the creator is right or wrong. That's the creator's place. And so he gets to decide what's sin and what's not sin. But then in addition to that, there's kind of this thing, that I think is important to understand in that, and that is that God is perfect. And, he is the creator of all things, and he is perfection. And the thing is perfection and imperfection don't go together. Like, if you have an apple that is absolutely perfect, but there's one tiny spot of mold on it, that apple is not perfect. It can't be perfect. And so it is with, things of God. God is perfect, and perfection and imperfection cannot coexist. They can't. And so God being all powerful and sovereign over all things, rather than him being made imperfect by the imperfection, his perfection destroys the imperfection. And so that's where God's judgment of sin comes in play. Sin is imperfection. Like so many times in the Bible, our sin is called iniquities, shortcomings. It's imperfection. And that's what Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We fall short of perfect. We're sinful. And so God being perfect can't coexist with imperfection. And so in order for us to be in God's presence in heaven, we must first be perfect. And so God can't allow the imperfection into heaven. His perfection destroys it. And so that's what God's judgment is that destruction of sin. And that's what makes the promise of who Christ is and what he provides so wonderful, because it's through Christ, through the work of Christ, that our sins are forgiven and we are made perfect. His righteousness makes us perfect. The work that Christ did allows that imperfection to be removed from us so it can be destroyed, but we get to enter into the presence of God. And so that's that God being perfect is the reason there has to be judgment. And sometimes it can be hard to really wrap our minds around and understand, but that is the way it is, that God's justice and God's perfection demand that wrongdoings be punished and that imperfections be destroyed. And so that's how can a loving God judge sin? How can a loving God condemn people to hell? And the truth is that if he didn't, he wouldn't be perfect. If he didn't, he wouldn't be just. And if he didn't, he wouldn't really be God. And so that's just a part of who he is. And that's how it has to happen, that sin has to be judged so that perfection can be, so that our imperfections can be removed and we can be made perfect and be in his presence. And so that's my encouragement to you today. Just a little theological thing. And, as we think about it, we get to be a part of this work that God is doing, where he is removing the imperfection so it can be destroyed, and in the process making us perfect so that we can be with him. That is God's love. God's love is removing that imperfection and making us perfect so we can be with him. That's how his love and his justice and his judgment all work together. And that is the glory and the promise of who Christ is, of what Christ was doing. That is what we celebrate when we celebrate Christmas, that God, in his infinite wisdom and his infinite love, found a way for us to be made perfect and for our sins to be dealt with so that we can be in his presence. That's the love of God, and that's the promise of Christ that God fulfilled when Christ was born. And so my encouragement to you is to just hold tight to that God does punish sin. God does have judgment and wrath for the wrongdoings that we commit, but the grace that he shows us through Christ is immense, and it's wonderful, and it is what protects us from the judgment that we have earned, from the wrath that we deserve. And so hold tight to Christ, hold tight to his forgiveness, and make sure that when those sinful things creep into your life, that you are repenting of them so that you can continue to be in the shadow of Christ and protected from that judgment that sin brings. So that's my encouragement to you. I hope and pray that God's speaking to you this week and that you are following him well. Thanks, and God bless.